Dead man talking. Tonight's show is all about fangs and tooth, and pertaining to the werewolf and dogman or shadow dogman varieties of cryptid encounters and experiences. Of course, I hope you guys enjoy this as ever. Please do let me know down below in the comments. Please do like and share, and don't forget to hashtag Team Fear. Without further ado, let's get into tonight's first story, entitled Backwoods Hotel Massacre. Let's get straight into that. My wife and I have been made homeless recently. It was a willing venture, nothing forcing us by the landlord or destruction. The trailer where we were living was falling apart and we refused to keep paying rent for a place the landlord would rather just let rot than actually put any money into. I'm no handyman and we couldn't afford to have someone come and fix the floors, windows, plumbing and so on. We left the slumlord with his slums and refused to clean or pay the last month's rent. We're not jerks normally, but when you went over a week waiting for the landlord to come and fix the tub so you could bathe yourself and have to ask your neighbour and relative to use their shower, yeah, you start to get spiteful as well. We decided to stay at a cheap hotel till we got the money together for a new place and looking for a place to rent. Our choices were limited since most of the affordable apartments and trailers were either rented out or as bad as the place we'd left. We had a ground floor room and it was a smoking room. They didn't have any available non-smoking rooms. We spent the first day cleaning the room to get rid of the smoke smell. I'm an ex-smoker and I now vape heavily. The stink of cigarette tar hit my craving spot and disgusted me all at the same time. By nightfall, the room was tolerable and we settled down for some rest. The next morning, I was vaping and reading my first Lord of the Rings books. It was the first time I'd read them, and it was the first of the 3-book box set that featured pictures and scenes from the movie. I'd been absent-mindedly vaping the whole time. About 30 minutes later, maybe less, the smoke alarm went off. "Are you kidding me right now?" I said as I jumped up and opened the door to fan out the vapour that now filled the room. As I found out the fog outside, the manager came walking up looking both worried and angry. "What happened?" he asked with his thick Indian accent. "The smoke alarm is much more sensitive than I thought, sorry." "Oh, okay. You smoke outside from now on," he said, looking both relieved and slightly annoyed. He really was a good guy. He worries about his property because it's both his livelihood and his home. "I don't smoke anymore. It's vapour. I vape." But he was already walking away and he didn't understand what I said or meant because he just repeated what he'd already said about smoking outside. Later, I went into work in town. I work at the lumberyard. Most everyone does in town. It was about a 30-minute drive to town from the middle of nowhere hotel, and I was happy to get back to some kind of normality. The wife works at the grocery store and she waits at the cafe around the corner for me to get off work. After a good day of work, I picked her up and we went back to the room. Learning from my lesson that morning, I left the door to the room open so the alarm wouldn't trigger again. This seemed to do the trick, and soon I settled in to read my book while my wife took her turn in the shower. She usually showers second since I'm the one that stinks after a long day at the mill. As I was sitting there in the bed reading my book, I felt like I was being watched. I looked up and out of the door. Nothing was there. I chuckled to myself and went back to reading. But I still had that creepy feeling and would glance around outside every now and again. Soon, my wife came out wearing her cute pink nightie and a seductive look in her eyes. I got up quickly and shut the door. Here, you will just have to use your imagination. Some things should just stay between married couples. Afterwards, she covered up and I opened the door to vape and bask in my manliness at my recent activities. As I sat there taking a pull of my mod and enjoying the flavour of my e-juice, peach and mango with a hint of mint, I couldn't help but get that feeling again, but this time I ignored it. But as soon as I decided to ignore the feeling, I noticed a movement out the corner of my eye. I looked quickly and caught a blur moving just out of sight around the doorframe. I got up and moved to the door to catch whoever it was that was peeking at me and my wife, but nobody was there. Scratching my head, I walked back to the bed, but this time I kept my eyes on the door. After about 5 or 10 minutes, nothing happened, and I closed the door and went to bed. The next day was pretty routine. Work, wife, room, sleep. It went like this for a couple of weeks, and every day I kept getting that feeling that I was being watched. Again, every time I would look to either see nothing or just a blur. On the 15th night, The wife wanted to go and stay with her sister who was getting ready to have a baby. My wife was her midwife or wet nurse or whatever it is. I don't pay attention to these things. But she was excited. And I didn't want to listen to my sister-in-law cry or moan all night. I had the room to myself for the night. I lay there again, as I have been, and vaped and read. The feeling came on again and I ignored it again. I kept reading for another hour when the thing appeared in the corner of my eye. I looked up and it was gone. And this time, I didn't get up. All around me, I could hear the other tenants' TVs blaring. I ignored it, mostly because I never really watched TV. After a while I tuned them out. I had been reading for about 3 hours when I saw the thing in the corner of my eye. I decided not to look, and it stayed there. I couldn't make out what I saw at all, and it didn't move. It stayed for about 15 minutes, but then was joined by another shape and another. This time I looked up, and to my horror I saw faces. Not human faces, but not exactly human. They were like foxes, but strange. Stretched and in a grotesque smile, tongues dangling out the side of the smiles, drool pooling at their very large, hairy feet. The hands, or paws, whatever, were huge and clawed and dripping red. I would call them werewolves, but I knew for a fact it wasn't a full moon. Now, I have heard stories about these things in the woods, but I always considered it just to be that. Stories. They huffed and puffed and stared. The first one that was closest moved first, lunging at me, and the others followed suit. Now, not to brag, but I've always been very agile, and my buddies would call me Catman, saying that I could dodge rain in a downpour. I ducked the first, sidestepped the second, hurtled the third and ran out the door. As I escaped my room, I came upon a scene of horror I never expected. The rooms that had people were open and blood was everywhere. Killed in their rooms and dragged outside by these creatures. As I came outside I saw more of the things coming out of the rooms, one holding a head of the manager and chewing his arm. Hearing the trio behind me regrouping for another go, I ran like hell and made it to my truck. As I closed the door, the three smashed into the door, rocking the whole truck with the impact. I already had the keys in hand from the visor and was starting the truck before they got back up. As the truck roared to life, I saw that the others were now racing towards me. I gunned the engine and buried the pursuers in the dirt and pine needles as I made my way for the dirt road that led to the main road to town. Driving to the police station, because I didn't have the time to grab my cell phone, I skidded to a halt and ran inside. Now I grew up with the sheriff, and when I told him the story, he didn't laugh. He sat me down, ran a breathalyzer and sent a couple of deputies, and rang the local wildlife officers as well. He handed me a cup of bad, cold coffee and waited for the call from the hotel. When it finally came, his face turned white, and he looked at me dumbfounded. Nothing was at the hotel except bodies, blood, and wolf prints. Nothing more came of the nights, and it was chalked up to an animal attack. My stories was considered confusion and fear mixed to make it seem like it was monsters. I know what I saw. My wife and I moved to another state and lived with a cousin of mine for a while. We never went back, and we never will. My wife agrees that it was just my mind playing tricks and not a pack of wolf-like creatures. She lets me have my fantasies about that night. Glad she wasn't there, and to this day, I jump at the sight of dogs or the sound of howling. Full Moon Massacres. Let's get straight into that. The title says it all. Let me go ahead and say that I believe in the paranormal like ghosts, demons, etc. However, I have always had a hard time believing in monsters like vampires, ghouls, etc. Though I do believe in Native American monsters like the Skinwalkers and Wendigo. The reason I am saying this is because I am stumped as to what is going on in my hometown. And it only happens during the full moon. These past 2 full moons have bared sinister happenings, namely the massacre of pets and livestock. 2 full moons ago, mine and 3 of the neighbours' cats were killed. I never saw my cat's body after being freshly killed, but I did see it while it was decomposing. It was not pretty. As for my neighbours' cats, I saw the fresh corpses. They were torn apart in a very brutal fashion. Of course, where I live, Florida, we have panthers, bears, coyotes, red wolves, etc. So it's not at all that crazy of an idea that one of these predators just got hungry. However, I found out a few days later that it wasn't just our cats, but several other people had dead cats, and the only connection was that all of these cats had been outside on the night of the moon. Also, no dogs were killed, which I find slightly strange as well. Now, getting to the massacre during the last full moon, one of my friends who lives 5 minutes away from me owns goats. 10 goats to be exact. This past full moon, all of them were killed. No evidence of what did it, just 10 torn apart goats. We looked for evidence, but being that it had just rained that night, any footprints had been washed away by the rain. Whatever did this must have been false, since there were no other killings that I know of. I feel like I'm living in a horror movie right now. I don't understand what is killing these animals, but it is very vicious. It may just be a pack of coyotes or a very vicious panther, but I would think, if that was so, more killings would happen besides on full moons. It's crazy, but I honestly am willing to consider a creature like a werewolf to be the culprit. It has been a legend where I live, and since most legends carry on a bit of truth, I am willing to believe. Does anyone have an idea of what is going on? If so, please share with me. Listen to Campground rules. Let's get straight into that. When I was a kid, my parents sent me to Christian camp every year during the summer. Despite the Christian atmosphere, the campgrounds were rife with ghost stories and rumours, most of them made up. That the campgrounds had some history, and the founders of the camp had their own cabin, which was repurposed as a camper's cabin. It was more of a shed, but rumour was it was haunted. With side paths and several clearings hidden away in the forested parts, people would sneak away and do unorthodox things. Satanic rituals were rumoured to take place, but were probably not true. The way the camp was set up, about half of the cabins were in lightly wooded areas closer to the entrance of the camp. The other half in the lodge bordered a well-kept field, with taller and unruly grass stretching further off to meet the forest on the other side of the field. When I was about 6, I was assigned to a cabin by the field. It was an A-frame cabin and was sweltering hot. The camp, being nestled in the mountains, could, oddly enough, afford complex kitchenware, but skimped on comfort for campers. Most of the nights I slept on top of my sleeping bag as opposed to inside of it. The bathrooms were separate from the cabin, and being 6 and very much afraid of the dark, especially in the dark, unfamiliar, lightless place, I often found myself terrified to sleep for fear of wetting the bed. Our counsellor, Josh, was really relaxed and, looking back, was probably the most chill counsellor I've ever had. He was in the Army Reserve and let us get away with a lot of things that never really flew after that year. The camp was pretty much strict about the rules. Lights out by 9, no venturing out of your cabin unless to use the bathroom. You couldn't even buy more than 1 soda from the commissary. Josh told us that some rules are better left broken. At least that way you experience more of life. As the week progressed, I found myself becoming more courageous. 0 was the point where I was brave enough to venture a few feet away from my cabin at night to pee. On our last night, Josh proposed that we spend the night in the field. We would pretend to go to bed at lights out. The staff would walk around with headlights to make sure everyone was in their beds, and then sneak out when we no longer saw the headlamps of the wandering staffers. We snuck out a little early and we were startled by a straggler staffer. Josh hissed at us to drop down on the ground near to the bushes to blend in with the darkness. The staffer didn't seem to notice us in their peripheral, but he seemed frantic by the way he was running towards the staff lodge. I noticed his panicked and clumsy footfalls as he ran to the cabin for the night, thinking, amused at how a grown man could be afraid of the dark too. We settled down by the tall grass, and when my eyes adjusted to the darkness, the stars above shone down on us, as if I was looking at the cosmos itself. Josh was making some speech about how the stars were made by God, but I just ignored it and gazed up, comforted by the vague mischief we'd caused, and the camaraderie I now shared with my cabin mates. Josh said he would wake us before the morning bell so we wouldn't get in trouble. I don't know when I fell asleep. Josh was talking about our creation, and suddenly, deafening silence only interrupted by the gentle sway of the tall grass in the breeze. I don't know what had woken me, but the sight of the stars and the gentle sound of grass was already lulling me back to sleep. Before I could fall back to sleep, I heard it. A gentle crunch in the tall grass. I was panicked, but when I didn't hear the sound a second time, I calmed myself down, telling myself it was a rabbit. A second crunch, this time a little heavier. My eyes flew open and I slowly turned on my side to face the other cabin mates to see if they'd woken up too. If there happened to be a mountain lion, I didn't want to become a target by making any sudden movements. The crunching sound became more frequent and sounded as if it was coming closer, as if someone or something was. At first trying to be sneaky but giving up halfway through. I was on my side face to face with one of my cabin mates named Cody, my back to the long grass. Behind me the crunching got closer and louder. I was tearing up in unbridled fear. If I got up it might go away, but on the off chance it didn't, would it attack me? Would this be my last night alive? As my thoughts raced and footsteps got closer, I felt as if I was being watched by some sinister presence. Just as I was about to get up and bolt, Cody stirred slightly. His eyes fluttered and then opened wide in fear as he looked past me and to whatever thing was behind me. Laboured, heavy breathing came from the grass behind me. Cody was considering running, I could tell. I softly shook my head, my eyes probably betraying my own fear. He gulped, and another one of our cabin mates let out a soft groan in her sleep. I could feel the eyes of whatever was behind me lift his whole boring gaze off of me for a moment and my other cabin mate. Shivering uncontrollably, I felt like I was going to witness something gruesome. The thing behind me let out a soft guttural growl, sounding oddly human, yet bestial. I could sense it tense up, as if it was ready to attack. Before it could, however, some coyotes yipped off in the distance, drawing the beast's attention away from us. The footfall sounded as if it was retreating to the forest, and Cody's eyes seemed to relax a little. We waited for what felt like hours before Cody breathed to me. "Do you think it's gone?" I nodded, but he could see that I wasn't even convincing myself. We both stayed awake all night and hardly spoke a word at breakfast. Before we left that year, I asked Cody what he saw, and he explained that what he saw had the body of an excessively skinny man. His hands weren't of his own, but rather ended like in dog-like paws, with long, retractable claws. Cody had said it came out when our cabin mates made noise. He didn't have a human head, or if he did, it was hidden by what appeared to be a head of a stag. The only other person Cody told about the creature was Josh, but Josh thought he was spreading another rumour and played it off. I never saw Cody back at camp and we lost contact. Josh deployed to Iraq and unfortunately lost his life in 2001. There's a flagpole erected in honour of Josh in the middle of the field where we slept. I've been known to have a pretty awful night. I've been known to have some pretty awful nightmares, and I always just thought that it's exactly what it was until I got more and more interested in cryptids. The world is a large and scary place, and while the campgrounds were especially gorgeous, I don't think I'll ever return if it was a Skinwalker like I think it is. Since I left, there have been disappearances here and there throughout the years, and I wonder if anyone would ever believe me. Did I meet a Skinwalker in New Mexico? Advice. A year or so ago, I left England for the summer in order to travel a bit and maybe find some work abroad for a few months. I managed to stumble across a decently paying job as a farmhand in the northwestern area of the Navajo Nation Reservation in New Mexico. The farmer was looking for somebody to help him with busy work over the summer and allow me to sleep in what I can only describe as a cabin, basically a big shed he had renovated in order to house whoever he had working for him at that moment in time. It was a large farmland and the shed was situated pretty much parallel to the house across the largest field of crops. Living in this shed with me was a half Native American boy who was about the same age as me. Name's Ahiga. Apologies if I misspell, it's been a while since I wrote or spoke of his name. Anyway, I arrived at the cabin after a long and stressful journey by plane and then pretty much hitchhiking my way across the USA. I met the farmer and the boy and they both seemed friendly enough. Everything was smooth sailing for about 2 weeks, even with the relentless heat beating down on my pale English skin. Ahiga and I became close and we were around each other 24/7. He would always tell me interesting stories of Navajo legend. He often told me of the Nalushi Skinwalkers in detail, and he seemed very knowledgeable on the subject. He told me how he dreamed of these creatures often. It seemed like he had some kind of morbid obsession with these things. I chalked it up to all horror stories and didn't really put any stock into what he was saying, although it did interest me. I've never been one to believe in or fear the supernatural. One evening, after a heavy day of work, I headed back to the cabin to shower and change. I got back to the cabin, showered, got changed and sat down on my bed. There was no sign of Ahiga yet, which was weird because he would usually be back by now. I waved it off and left my cabin to head into the nearest town, if you will, just to explore a bit more of the land that I was staying in. I explored for a while and found a nearby bar to drink in, as I hadn't had a single drink since moving here. I left the bar around 10:30 PM, and it was pretty much fully dark. I began to walk back to the farm. As I walked back along the winding road, I felt as if I was being watched. I walked on a bit faster and made my way across to the farm. As I walked around the farmer's house, I noticed what looked like someone carrying a bag under their arm. Leaving my cabin, something felt and looked not right about this figure and its movements. I went stealth mode almost instinctively and took the long way round the field, hiding behind the fencing. I managed to get a good angle on the figure as he stood up, the light shining from the cabin illuminated, and I saw that it was a Higa. At first I was relieved, but then I saw how erratically he was moving, almost with no rhythm at all. Under his arm he clutched a dog's severed. I felt sick to my stomach and ducked down, but managed to compose myself. I poked my head up to check once more, and he was heading off into the forest. I took this opportunity to dart for the cabin and pull my keys out to unlock the door. As I got close, and I tripped and dropped my keys and thudded to the ground. I propelled myself back up and turned to see why I fell, and saw that I tripped over the rest of the beheaded dog. I swung around to look towards the woods and saw a Higa on all fours. Not like an animal, but like a person with their arms and legs bent in the wrong direction. It felt as if he was looking directly into my soul. He had 2 yellow, glowing eyes, and a confused look on his crooked face.
I am a Higa.
I think he tried to say, but the words were guttural and frothy, almost like Gollum from Lord of the Rings. I unlocked the door and bolted inside, locking it behind me and closing all the curtains and windows in the cabin. I sat awake all night, hearing noises and feeling watched somehow. I'd hear whatever it was at the door, now and again pretending to be a Higa. It would repeat parts of the stories a Higa had been telling me whenever we relaxed in the cabin together on previous nights, and every time it showed up, a horrific smell filled the cabin and made me vomit a few times. In the end, the harassment stopped, and daylight began to shine through the curtains. I checked out the window and saw nothing outside. I quickly gathered all of my possessions and got the fuck out of there. I flew back to England the next week after using all of my farmhand money to rent a hotel room on the east coast as far away from that place as I could. I often wonder what happened to a Higa, but I'm glad I didn't wait around to find out. Many of you won't believe this story, but I can assure you it's 100% true, and I still think about it at night to this day. I'm still not sure what I saw, but sometimes I feel as if I'm being watched, but I think this may just be paranoia. There's no stories of these things following you across the pond.
Is there?
There's something in my garage. Let's get straight into that. My family and I moved into our house in May of last year. I was nervous at first because after being obsessed with horror stories and films, one can get a little bit paranoid. I definitely thought the new house would be haunted, especially since it's surrounded by thick forest on all sides. At night, it can get super creepy. However, to my surprise, it's a relatively new house, so there were no real opportunities for a spirit to enter the house. For a year now, I felt safe. Unfortunately, that feeling didn't last long. Recently, I've been browsing through this subreddit, devouring the stories. You know how when you read a bunch of scary stories or whatever, you start noticing things more. That has been happening to me all week. I will wake up in the middle of the night and hear sounds coming from outside my window, or footsteps in the living room. Today was no different. We came back from a fun family trip to a little park, and the whole time, the only thing I was thinking of was the search and rescue stories from a few years ago. It totally freaked me out. So we come back, and I'm sitting on our back deck. Now, this deck overlooks a big yard, which is surrounded by woods. There are houses on either side of my house, but there is a thin strip of forest that separates our yards. The backyard, however, is probably about a mile-long stretch of woods. It gets dark around 5 PM, which is when this story occurred. Anyway, I was sitting on the deck when suddenly my cat got out. There was something wrong with his eye, making it harder for him to see. Because of this, we don't often let him outside, for fear that a coyote will get him. There are many around us. Today, however, I felt that it would be fine for him to roam around the yard for a bit, so I let my dog out as well, and the two of them kind of ran around outside. I turned my back for a second to check my phone, and when I turned back around, my cat was gone. My dog's tail was standing straight up, and I was immediately freaked out. My yard is big enough that there was no way my cat had run into the woods, because he isn't even that fast of a runner. So, he couldn't have just gone that far. He also wasn't under the deck. I ran up to the house frantically, asking my parents if they'd let him inside. They shook their heads. My dad called from the open window. "Just go check everywhere. Is he under the deck?" I told him that I'd already looked under there. "Did he get in the garage?" My mum asked. I glanced over. Sure enough, the back door to our garage was open. It was just a plain wooden door, so not much light was being shed into the garage. I was wary because, as I said before, I was already kind of freaked out, but I reluctantly went over to the ominous door. I could always turn the light on anyway, I said to myself. Well, As it turns out, I couldn't. No matter how many times I flipped the switch, the light didn't go on. Begrudgingly, I switched on the flashlight on my phone and continued. I would never forgive myself if I let my cat stay outside all night to be eaten. The light from the phone barely revealed anything. Just as I was about to give up, I heard a scratching coming from behind me. My first thought was my cat, so I called out, "Kitty! Here, Kitty!" I backed out the doorway, and as I did so, the sound of nails clacking on the cement floor followed me. I couldn't see where it was coming from with my flashlight, so I just kept calling for my cat. Just as my light shone on a pair of eyes, my mum called from the front yard. "Don't worry, sweetie. He's right at the front door." But if my cat was in the front yard, what was in my garage? This sudden realisation hit me, and before I could sprint away and shut the door, my light revealed what appeared to be a human hand clawing for my ankle. I slammed the door and ran inside, and I'm writing this now from my bedroom. And I'm too scared to tell my parents because they will definitely not believe me. Please help. What should I do in this situation? Of dogs and monsters. Let's get straight into that. Howls and screeches greeted David when he stepped outside, as did some of his men who waved or gave a friendly hello. Many were hard at work, either transporting large crates filled with squid and livestock, or reinforcing the barbed wire surrounding the farm. While the work might have been tough, David paid and treated the farmhands well. Dressed in a t-shirt and trunks, David made his way to the baby blue Mercedes. Business was booming for the past couple of years, and this was one of the few perks he enjoyed. Every now and then, however, he liked to take some time away from work and enjoy a jog. "Now, let's see what's on the radio," David said to no one in particular, before backing out of the farmstead's lengthy driveway. A few catchy tunes caught his ear, followed by some local news. The anchorman spoke of a string of grisly deaths at the hands of wild animal, but the police were confident it would be caught. When the fancy automobile came to a halt, David exited the car. Unlike the other runners, David preferred to visit when there weren't many people around. Luckily for him, fewer people had been showing up by the day, worried that they too might end up spirited away. Upon quickly surveying the park, the farmer saw a couple of people. One person, it seems, was sitting alone, a 15-year-old boy of African-American descent. His rather thin build and youthful features suggested someone several years younger. There was something odd about him though, whether it was the coat he wore or... David couldn't be sure. It wasn't cold, but the weather was fair, so it was a very light jacket at that. There was nothing he wasn't prepared for, so it mattered not. He sat a great distance away from the others, with earbuds half sunken into his hair. Dangerously far, some would say, but the youth didn't seem to mind. "Do you have the time?" Unfazed by the sudden emergence of another person, the boy simply retrieved his phone. "It's 5:21 p.m, he replied in a fittingly little boy voice. With the ice broken, David engaged his new friend in a conversation, all the while keeping track of the ever-dwindling number of people. "So, what are you listening to anyway?" asked David. "Random shit from the internet. It's the playlist of my soul," replied the boy. Ha ha ha! A roar of laughter emerged from David before he gave the park one final sweep. His laugh, while genuine, masked a blacker purpose. When everyone's departed save for the adult and the boy, David's demeanour darkened. "You know, kid, I like you, but..." "But?" asked the boy, puzzled by David's revelation before the older man asked him his name. "Alexander, but most people just call me Alex." Unsure of what else to do, he answered the adult's request with an obvious hesitation in his voice. David smiled wickedly before elaborating further. "But I'm hungry." Alex would have run at that point if he weren't cowering before the sight of David's true nature. Brown irises sunk into the rising sea of red until only a deep crimson remained. Fair skin followed suit with its own transformation, becoming leathery and turning an ashen grey. David's muscles flexed, expanding outward into almost cartoonish proportions. Bones snapped and twisted, and unnatural forces reshaped his musculature into something more akin to a large canine than a man. His ears curled inward before flattening and extending upward until they resembled a wolf's. It was around that point that the farmer's teeth sharpened to a knife-like point that Alex found the courage to flee, right before he could witness coarse black fur consume the man's body, completing his turn. Fueled by fear and adrenaline, Alex ran into the forest behind him. David, on the other hand, simply smirked as he saw his prey foolishly run ahead. Whatever salvation the boy sought he wouldn't find it in there. The farmer's toothy maw overflowed with saliva at the thought of sinking his teeth into the youngster. After fully finishing his rebirth, the newly inhuman beast wasted little time in running after him. He knew these woods quite well, so young Alexander's chances of escape were non-existent. It took mere minutes for the game of cat and mouse to end in a clearing. The newly reborn David stood before Alex, claws and fangs on display with a feral growl in his throat. However, it suddenly dawned on him that the boy's face no longer read of dread, but delight. This both puzzled and angered the transformed farmer, who merely snarled in return, preparing to pounce. At least he would, have it not for what happened next. Alex's coat started to violently shake, almost as if something was concealed beneath it. "Wanna see?" he asked the werewolf, who was suddenly unsure of what the youth was up to. Without hesitation, he tore off his jacket and shirt, uncovering countless small tumours, growths that peppered his tiny body, all of which pulsated with a sickly green brilliance, covered in a veiny network that scoured the boy's tummy and chest. Most disturbing were the 12 that resembled gaunt human faces, each more withered and ghastly than the next. Adding to the sheer eeriness of their existence were the characteristics that they held, such as moles or teeth. The grotesque things trembled, parting the layers of cancerous tissue where their eyes would be, revealing black pools. Upon seeing the beast before them, their collective expressions twisted into a pained rage. In his need to deny the reality before him, David contemplated if Alex was wearing some sort of elaborate costume. However, when the living lump spoke, shock grasped the pig farmer, freezing him in place. Pus pooled at the corners of their mouths, dripping down like saliva. "Join us in silence," they communicated in unison, speaking in an ancient rasp that wavered between male and female. "Within us there is no pain, no death. We promise only everlasting peace," said the many-headed things, undulating with anticipation. Imbued with supernatural haste, 6 of the tumours flew from the teenager's body, sinking their teeth into a stunned David. Wrinkled mounds of fat plastered in infected sores served as their heads and their necks were narrowed columns of flesh tied to Alexander's belly. In case you were curious, I'm a mutant created for the sole purpose of terminating creatures like you. I was sent here to eliminate whatever was threatening the civilian population in this area. After a little investigation, it turned out that threat was you. I just didn't want any witnesses, Alexander said with a noticeable arrogance in his words. Acting on the teen's command, the creature's worm-like bodies expanded and retracted as they pumped some unknown fluid into the unfortunate man-beasts. From the horror's mouths flowed a river of thick, viscous yellow sludge, which upon contact with the werewolf's skin burned him. Searing, hot mucus melted away first, eating away through layers of tissue and tendon. The surges of pain from the abomination's bite seemingly kick-started David's brain, awakening him from his trance. Instinctively, the farmer attempted to bite through the neck of the monstrosity closest to his right, causing the young boy to tense up in pain. Seeing the child falter, David used this opportunity to tear the vile extremities from his form. Clawed digits found homes in the inflamed meat, flailing wildly about. It was all he could do to try and escape. Screw this kid, the farmer thought. He'd rather be starving and alive than dead. Worry replaced Alexander's confidence, and he hurriedly pieced together a plan of action. After regaining his composure, the team willed more of his malignant growths to act. From the maws of the remaining 6 faces emerged swarms of the insectoid-like things. Held aloft by small wings, their forms were coated in throbbing blood vessels. A small hole resided upon their underbellies from which a throng of antennae hung. They bore a great resemblance to butterflies, only their flight lacked the silent grace such a creature. Instead, the horde's flight was marked by screams matching the swiftness of their comrades. They'd already overtaken David, pouring into any visible orifice. His nostrils and mouth were flooded with them by the dozens. The feelers at their bellies anchored into the werewolves' insides, filling them with eggs. Shortly after being laid, they exploded into thousands of carnivorous larvae. As the monsters chewed away at his intestines, David knew it was over. The man-beast couldn't even muster an anguished cry due to the living creature's nightmares clogging his throat. When there was no longer any space inside the man's head, parent and larvae alike spilled forth from his skull. Okay, that was bomb as fuck, Alexander said before his posterior collided with the ground. Hurry up and eat him up, barked the teen at his inhuman appendages. More than happy to comply with their freshly pubescent overlord, the creatures hastened their pace, greedily devouring the corpse's remains. A buzzing in his pocket tore Alexander's attention away from the fuzzy mess before him. "Hello?" he answered, his voice losing its youthful luster in favour of a more serious tone. "Yes, I have neutralised the threat, and I am now moving onto the farm." Wow, hope you guys enjoyed those short stories there in that compilation. As ever, please do let me know down below in the comments. Please do like and share. Got a brand new series coming up for you next week, guys. Hopefully should have a couple of episodes of that ready to go from Monday or Sunday night. Looking forward to getting that out and hearing your feedback. As ever, remember, above all, be safe, not sorry.